Okay, today I'm going to continue my discussion of Chapter 5 of The Future of an Illusion. And Chapter 5 has to do with the difference between science and religion. So basically, science and religion. And this is going to be actually probably the single most important distinction in the future of an illusion. Well, at least one of the main ones. The first, we already saw one big distinction between civilization and nature, between civilization and the individual. Now we have a distinction between science and religion. Freud's argument is going to be that science, the difference between science and religion is that science does not ask for your belief in anything. What it will do is it will give you evidence. If you ask why something is true in science will not say, well, you should believe it because of our authority, or you should believe it because you should have faith in us, or anything like that. Basically, science will say, look at the facts. Use your common sense, your reason, and look at the facts. So that's if you don't believe whatever. If you don't believe there's a cat in the next room, go look. That's anytime you're providing empirical evidence for something, that's scientific. If you don't believe that E equals mc squared, you could learn physics and mathematics and check it out step by step. If you don't believe that the sun is approximately 93 million miles away from the Earth, follow the logic, follow the reasoning of the astronomers who came up with that conclusion, and see if it works. So basically, science says if you don't believe it, go check it out for yourself. Freud says when it comes to religion, you can't check any of this stuff out because most of it happened, like with Christianity and Judaism, most of it happened a couple thousand years ago. So obviously, there's no way to go check it out. Okay, so you might say, well, yeah, we can't go back 2,000 years to check it out, but we can rely on, we have texts that come from the past. We can historians can go back and look at what our ancestors wrote down, and we could check it out that way. We can check it out we could check it out by doing historical research. Okay, first of all, Freud says let's look at Freud says that one reason why we are told to believe religious claims from the past, is because our ancestors believed it. That's one reason. Often you hear that. Well, one expression is, "Give me that old time religion." Something that has been around for a couple thousand years is authoritative. So one answer to why we should believe religious claims is that it's been believed for thousands of years. Okay, well, what's Freud's answer to that? What's wrong with believing what our ancestors have believed for thousands of years? Freud's answer is that our ancestors were ignorant. It's not that they weren't intelligent. They were just as intelligent as we are today. I mean, the IQ hasn't, the intelligence, natural intelligence hasn't changed. But they were ignorant. I mean, for thousands of years, people thought the Earth was flat. That doesn't mean we're supposed to believe the Earth is flat today. They used to believe that the sun went around the Earth. We don't believe that anymore. Our ancestors didn't know anything about plate tectonics. They didn't know anything about quantum mechanics, about gravity, or any of this other stuff. So Freud says our ancestors were ignorant. Means they didn't know as much as we now nowadays. Science knows a lot. It's increasing exponentially more because there's so many people who are involved in science. Scientific knowledge is growing and growing and growing and growing. What scientists know in 100 years from now will make us look today will make scientists look really stupid. So our ancestors were ignorant. That's one reason we can't base our beliefs upon our ancestors. A second reason that's often given for why we should believe religious claims is that there are proofs. There are proofs that we can know that certain things are true by proofs. Well, where are these proofs? Well, Freud is mainly concerned with the Judeo-Christian tradition. So he's in the Judeo-Christian tradition. The proofs are in the Bible. So, you often people argue, Christians, Jews argue that certain things are true uh, because it's in the Bible. Okay, and they open up the Bible and point to a verse, and they say, well, there, it's right there. It's in the Bible. And then if you don't believe it, they can often will quote, for example, when it comes to things in the gospel about Jesus, for example, they will say, well, uh, there were people there that, for example, the resurrection, if you don't believe in the resurrection, well, look at, there are disciples, they saw Jesus. Uh, and so you can, well, obviously if they saw the risen Jesus, then that would be good proof that he rose, right? But Freud's answer to that is that we can't just open up the Bible and accept whatever's in there as true, because the Bible has contradictions in it, basically like any historical document. You can't open up Herodotus or Thucydides or any historian and just read, what Thucydides said or Herodotus said, and therefore he said it. It must be true. No, I mean Thucydides, Herodotus, they often made up speeches. They tell you that. They often make up speeches because if they didn't know, if they weren't there to hear the person speak, they would make it up. They would they would put into a person's mouth what they thought the person would be saying. When you read Plato and you're reading the Apology, you hear speeches that Socrates gave, but no historians believe that Socrates literally said everything that Plato says he said. Basically, the gist is there, but not the details. And Freud says the same thing applies to the Bible. The Bible is just like any other historical document. You have to read it critically. You have to, and there are contradictions in it. Now, some people go to extraordinary lengths to explain away contradictions. Well, sure. I mean, if you start with the assumption that there are no contradictions, you can explain any contradiction away. You can always come up with a scenario, to explain any contradiction, even today. You can create elaborate constructions to explain anything. But anyway, Freud says that the Bible is full of contradictions, and that's basically taken. It's not to me. It's not a criticism of the Bible. It's just okay, contradiction. So what? But anyway, so contradictions. So since there are contradictions in the Bible, you simply can't take it at face value. You have to apply your critical reason to what you're reading. Okay, so that's the second thing. The first one was we should believe what our ancestors said. Freud's answer to that is that our ancestors were ignorant. There are proofs that Jesus, for example, walked on water, that Jesus performed miracles. What are the proofs? Well, because people in the Gospels, they actually saw him do this. Freud says, well, that's what the Bible says, but why should we believe what the Bible says? The Quran says many things. Christians don't believe what the Quran says. Well, the Muslims can say, well, why not? It's in the Quran. Or the Book of Mormon says certain things, and the Mormons believe it. But other people don't believe it. But the Mormons will say, well, it's right there. It's written down. So basically, Freud says we need to apply our critical thinking to the scriptures that we have, whatever they are, whether it's the Quran, the Bible, whatever. So in addition to why should we believe the religious claims of Judeo-Christianity, the answer that Freud says, well, our ancestors believed it. Freud says they were ignorant. The Bible says so. He says there are contradictions in the Bible, and we can't simply take things at their face value. Another reason is that that what has been given for a couple thousand years is pretty much, don't ask. So for a couple thousand years, or about 1,000 years, when people would call into question certain things in the Bible, for example, whether Moses wrote the Bible, there were people questioning that from around 1,000 years ago. But when people did question the Bible, it was very, very dangerous. And many people would never question the Bible. They would never write anything that would even question the authority of the Bible because it was very dangerous. They could be imprisoned. They could be tortured. Think of Galileo, put under house arrest for suggesting that the Earth revolved around the sun and rotated on its axis. So many, for 1,000 years or so, many people, many brilliant scholars simply would not publish books saying what they really believed about the Bible, because if they were calling into question its authority, they could be killed or imprisoned. So basically, the Freud says when you're asked why you should believe certain claims of Christianity or Judaism, you're given three different answers. You should believe it because our ancestors believed it. Freud says, well, that's not a good reason because they were ignorant. You should believe it because there are proofs in the Bible. Freud says, well, that's assuming that's begging the question. You're assuming that the Bible is reliable, and that has to be established. And the third one is don't ask. And Freud says whenever people say don't ask, that's pretty much it makes it pretty clear that they're not very certain about what they believe, whether the evidence is going to justify it. That's why they say don't ask. So Freud says the Bible doesn't lend, the tradition and the Bible don't lend credence to many religious claims, specifically about God's existence. And then so Freud says, well, let's look at in the modern world. Maybe we can find some evidence for the existence of God by consulting the spiritualists. I mean, they're the ones the mediums consult the dead. The dead the dead talk about God, and they bring up messages from the afterlife. So Freud says, well, maybe spiritualism will lend some credence to religious claims. And Freud says, well, if you actually look at what the mediums say, it's pretty obvious that anyone can make their stories up. I mean, basically, what do they say? Love each other. The world's in trouble. The mediums never come back. They never talk to anybody that's dead who comes back, with a new theorem, a new theory about science. Or they never bring they never tell us anything that we didn't already know, except utter, platitudes. And Freud says it's obviously they're just making this stuff up. So let's look at a couple of other alternatives. Another alternative is the idea that goes back to Tertullian, the church father Tertullian in around the 4th century, and his very famous statement, I believe because it is absurd. I think he was referring to the resurrection. I believe because it is as absurd, and Kierkegaard often talks about the paradox of Christianity. You should believe because it's absurd. And Freud's answer to that is that ought we to believe every absurdity? Freud says the ultimate judge must always be reason. And whenever anybody asks you to believe something which is absurd, that contradicts your reason, you should reject it. And now, if individually you want to believe something that's absurd, that's up to you. But Freud says that no one is incumbent on believing anything that's absurd. So that's not an answer either to why we should believe religious claims. And the last one in chapter 5 that he mentions is the claim that the philosophy of as if, which was created by a German philosopher, Weihinger, in the early 20th century. And and when it comes to God, he would say we ought to believe that God exists because we're better off believing it. We should pretend that there's a God because it will be better for our society, for our morality, and so on. And Freud's answer to that, is that only a philosopher would say something like that. So whenever Freud talks about philosophy and future of an illusion, he's always very, very critical of it. Only a philosopher would say would put forth the theory of we ought to pretend as if the claims of Christianity or Judaism were true. The final thing I want to say is that Freud takes his son when he had a son. He takes him as kind of a model. When his son was a little boy, and other kids would tell little stories, and Freud, his son would ask the kids, "Is this a fairy? Is it true? Is it a fairy story?" And if they say, "Yeah, it's just a fairy story," his son would walk away in disdain. Because his son was interested in factual things, not fairy tales. So anyway, that's basically Freud's view in chapter 5. Religion basically tells us things that cannot be verified or justified with any evidence. Science is based upon evidence. It's that distinction which is going to be called into question in the rest of Future of an Illusion. between science and religion.